Into Google News by me, Joe Balestrino. And if you don't know who I am, and this is your first time seeing one of my videos, I'm an SEO Google Ads expert who started out in 2004, so I've been around for quite a while. And I've spent a lot of time learning about SEO. I've spent a lot of time working with publishers. I've written a few books and a couple of guides on SEO and paid search and marketing in general. I consulted for the brands you see on the screen and many others that just could fit there on the screen. I was the head of SEO at a company called ALM Media, which is a publishing company that owns about 30 to 35 online publications, all news related, all with their own editorial teams and reporters. I worked there 4 years, so that alone is a ton of experience when you're juggling that many websites in the news space. I trained editorial teams both at ALM and outside of ALM, and I've been cited in the news as a somewhat expert on SEO and Google Ads by CNBC, NBC, NPR, and a few other news outlets. What does Google tell publishers? Now, this is bad news for publishers because prior to 2019 or December 2019, getting included was a manual process. And as daunting as that may sound, it was a lot easier because you actually spoke to a human. And the company I worked for at the time, ALM, the president there had a good connection with someone at Google who I was put in touch with, and I was able to learn about what Google favored and didn't favored, and having the feedback to make the changes is always nice. But in 2019, Google did away with the manual review and just told everyone, hey, this is automated now, so you can stop bothering us about this, and we'll include you when and if we think you are, worthy of being in Google News. And publishers just pretty much threw their hands up and said, this is crazy. How are we supposed to know what, when or how to get into Google News if there's no feedback? And Google put together some quality guidelines and some content policies, but as with Google, a lot of things are very vague, and they don't want you to know everything because they don't want you to game the system. And the only way to really know is if you've done this a bunch of times. And even as many websites that I've worked on, I still discover things that I scratch my head and go, I wonder if Google really would mind if I didn't do this or I did do that, and turn out to be like something small, had a bigger impact. And so it's kind of hard just to kind of wing it and go through it. But I wanted to put this together to kind of give you some guidance and point you in the right direction. Now, the first step, if you haven't done this already, is to go to Publisher Center and add your website domain. They'll ask you for RSS feeds. I encourage you to, if you have individual sections of your news site, to go through the process of letting Google know each section of your website. If you have a sports section and an RSS feed for it, put it in there. Local news, gossip news, or whatever you have, whatever categories you have in your site, I would certainly recommend that you go through and take the time to do that. Now, one thing that you need to understand is that being in Google Publisher is not the same as being in Google News. So a lot of times publishers will contact me and say, I'll ask them, are you in Google News? And they'll say, yes, I'm in Google Publisher. And I say, no, are you in Google News? Because Google Publisher is just publisher. Publisher is just you telling Google, hey, I want to be in Google News. I'm raising my hand. Please pay attention to me. But that's it. So unless you go to Google and then go to the Google section, the Google tab in Google, and put in the URL of your website or specific titles of news articles that you've written, and you don't show up there, you're not in Google News. And if you do show up there, then you need to figure out is how recent is the news? Is news being published an hour ago, today, last week, 2 weeks ago, 6 months ago. That's kind of indication to me, if there's there could be possible issues with how Google's, understanding the content. But just understand that, being in Google News does not mean being Google Publisher, I should say, does not mean you're included in Google News. So they're two separate things. One, though, can influence the other, but it's just letting Google know that you are interested in being included. Now, Google has attempted to give some feedback to publishers to give them some guidance. And one thing that's really important if you're looking to be included in Google News is Google pays a lot of attention to the authority of your website. Now, if you understand a little bit about SEO, authority sometimes can be related to links and link building, like people linking to you. News organizations don't ever do link building because when you write stories and people read them, they typically tend to link to them. It's natural, and Google expects that. So it's not authority in that sense. It's more the authority of who are you as an organization, and more importantly, who's writing for your organization and what are their expertise in writing about this news. Are they just a freelance writer? Is this the only thing they do? Have they written for other websites on similar topics? Or are they jack of all trades and they write about everything? So Google wants to understand that. And I just highlighted this specific section, but I would recommend, I'll put the link in the description below. I would recommend that you go through all of these and read them and understand what it is that Google expects from your website, and then go and compare the way your content is created, the way your site is structured, and how it compares to what Google is looking for here. This slide here comes directly from Google. Google wants you to know that ads and sponsored content shouldn't exceed your content. What do they mean by that? Years ago, Google came out with a penalty called top heavy. And top heavy was the name that was given because when the page loaded of your website, so let's say I Googled a news story, I clicked the link, I go to your website, and there was more ads above the fold than there was content, you would get hit with a penalty and your content would be demoted because of the ads. If you have more sponsored content on your website than you do actual unique content, then that could be a penalty as well, and that will go against you being considered into Google News because your content is not unique and is not original. There's other things that Google wants you to know, like clear dates and bylines. Google wants to know when was this article published so that they know the freshness of the content, so that they also know when it expires, because to Google and in the real world, like, news is only X amount of days old, and then after that it expires and it's worthless. So they want to know the dates. Again, bylines, they want to know who's writing the content, having links to bylines that take the user to all the articles that a particular author has written on your website is also useful. And all the information you see here, I've also put together a slide here that talks about things that I know that most people overlook. Some of it has overlap with the screen prior, but having a specific Google News sitemap is really key, because if your content is not solely Google News, and even if it is, you still need a Google News specific sitemap, is if you have content that's mixed, Google's not going to go through your website and figure out, oh, this is sports news, this is not news, this is commentary. Google's not going to do that. And so Google wants to see a specific news sitemap. And if that news sitemap doesn't follow the criteria that Google outlines, then it still may not include it in Google News, because, Google's looking for, certain dates, certain content being in there. And so if Google crawls the map and determines that one of the links in there in the news sitemap is opinion, and that's to Google, that's not news, obviously, then it's going to stop crawling the sitemap. And then if it stops crawling the sitemap, then the pages aren't going to get indexed, and then you won't show up in Google News. So that's really important. You want to make sure you take that sitemap submit it in Google Search Console because you want to be able to see if Google's kicking back any errors. And the only way to do that is to upload it to Search Console and go in there and check and see, is Google giving you any feedback. And back in the day, they would give you way more feedback. They would tell you if the content was paraphrased, or it was is broken out in a way that Google didn't like it. There was too much space between paragraphs, and Google thought that the content was broken up and wasn't sure where the article began and where the article ended. Too many ads in the copy. Like, Google did away with all of those things, which makes it even more difficult to kind of understand what Google wants and what Google doesn't want. Have an in-depth page about us being the company as a whole, what you stand for, what your passions are, why the company was started, what's your beliefs, so that, because outside of the home page, the About Us page is probably the second most viewed page of any website. Not just for news, but in general. Most people, before they buy something, and they're buying from a company or a business, or they're reading something from somebody they don't know, they tend to go to the About Us page to learn about what this company stands for, or kind of get a sense of who they are before they go and read the content. Hence why I started this presentation with giving you some information about me, because you would want to know who is presenting this and what are my qualifications for presenting this. The same goes with the About Us page. What are your qualifications for your team writing this content? And adding bios and links to the authors' pages, or the writers, having their social media links so that Google could associate their Twitter profile and their LinkedIn profile. All of that is benefit to you. And so I would make sure that you take the time to show Google actually how your content is created and by who, so that Google can trust the content that's being created. Because there's a lot of bogus content out there, which is why Google probably stopped putting resources towards this. I've come across companies where in the past they would say, "Oh, I just outsourced to another country and I charge them $1, and I just have them rewrite news stories," and they wanted to hire me to help them get into Google News, but just by looking at the content, how it was written, and the lack of transparency and the lack of authority, there was nothing that I could do to improve the outcome of getting them into Google News, because Google would see right through it that this was not a legitimate company. Some additional information from Google. I put together some resources. Google put up a developers page, a post that talks about the most common questions since they've switched to an automated review process. The last time that page was updated was about a year ago. So I'm pretty sure this is not a page that's going to be updated as much. And some other information about how to get your site to appear. Some of it will be some of the things I've already covered here, but it's still good to go through and review. I want you to understand, like, what is news, and working with publishers, there's a disconnect on what is news, and it's clear to me because I work in it all the time, and I want to understand this process, because this sometimes is a barrier that is hard to get over, that's going to impact your ability to get into Google News. News is happening right now. As we speak, news is happening. So news is typically written in present tense. It also includes who, what, where, and when, right? So news is factual. It's not editorial. It's not anything other than news. And so when you write news stories that say Boston Red Sox ball player reaches newest heights with largest deal ever, that is so vague, that is so broad, and you not only would you not get traffic from Google News, you wouldn't even get traffic from Google off of that search, because the title is the most important thing that, or it's the first thing that Google crawls on your web page. So that title is going to dictate to Google what the rest of the page is about. So you want to have your keywords in there, but your keywords are the who, what, where, and when. So think about if you were to get on an elevator with someone and you were getting off and you only had one sentence or 15 seconds to tell them what the news story you just wrote about was, so that they can go and Google it because they want to know more about what you wrote. You would tell them the name of the ball player, the team that the ball player played for, and the amount, right? Because those are things that stick out in your mind. I know we don't listen to radio as much as we used to, but if you were watching news on television and you saw a story and you got the tail end of a story, and you would only pick out a few bits and pieces, you would pick out who, the what, the where, or the why, or even the what, as to, okay, this ball player is getting X amount of dollars. I'm going to Google this player's name and that amount, or the ball player's name and the team, so that you can find the story and so that you can continue reading about it. And a lot of people, when they write content, because it's boring, I get it. You're in a news organization, you're cranking out content all day long, you're trying to make it exciting. That works for newspapers. If somebody bought a newspaper, you could title anything you want in the newspaper because they've already bought it. So there's no need. Now publications online have to drive traffic. They have numbers to meet. And the more literal you are with the content you write, the better you are at getting searches. Save the witty, funny play on words for social media, because those titles should be different. Like, you can change the title on social media if you wanted to, so that you're getting, you're clickbaiting it, find out who's making the most ever in baseball, and get them to click. Then that's fine. But you got to think about how people search. And one way to do that is, if you only had a few words to tell someone what the story was about so they can Google it, you would change the way you wrote the titles. I wrote a guide on Google News. I call it the Google News Handbook. I wrote it a few years ago. It's slightly dated now that Google has changed some things, but it still has a ton of value. And so anyone who's watching this video that's interested in getting this PDF, just contact me through my website. Say, hey, Joe, I checked out your video, and I'd like a copy of that Google Handbook, the Google News Handbook. I'd be more than happy to send it over to you. Now, previously seen on Google News. Now, if your website has been in Google News in the past, and you know for a fact it's been in Google News because you were included prior to December 2019, then you may just have a technical issue. Maybe you redesigned the website and things broke, or you stopped updating the Google News sitemap because of the redesign, or you changed the way you've written content, or maybe it's the way your site is structured. It could be a number of things, but you're more likely to get back in if you were already included. And maybe, like in the example I gave earlier, some content's getting shown, but not all of it. It's usually a technical issue. And so what you would want to do is probably speak to a Google News expert. Shameless plug here. So if you find that you're running into that problem, it's always good to speak to somebody who has some experience. And I'm sure there's other Google News experts out there that could help you. The message boards on Google are kind of helpful, but not really, because since Google is not doing this manually, you're going to get a lot of the boilerplate responses and links to go to what I've already included. So if you found this video helpful, please subscribe, like the video. I'm going to crank out a bunch more of these in the next coming days and weeks. So if there's anything that you want to see in particular, please leave it in the comments below, and I'll be sure to respond. Thanks.